stars were dying wrong, not the familiar death of supernovas that painted nebulae in brilliant funeral pyres, nor the gradual dimming that marked the natural end of stellar cycles, but something far more profound and terrible. Where once the galaxy's spiral arms had blazed with the light of 1,000,000 civilizations, now there bloomed wounds of perfect darkness, as if entire systems had been surgically excised from reality itself. The astropaths called it the Great Quieting, though their screams when they attempted to probe those silent regions suggested a horror beyond their ability to comprehend or communicate. The wrongness registered first in the deepest tomb worlds, where chronosense arrays older than most species detected the impossible mathematics of absence. Ancient Necron sensors, calibrated to measure the pulse of galactic time itself, found their readings corrupted by something that defied all understanding. This was not destruction, but erasure, not conquest, but a transformation so complete it left no echoes in the warp's turbulent currents. Monument worlds that had stood for millions of years simply ceased to exist, their impossible architectures crumbling into void-touched dust that remembered nothing of what it had once been. From his stasis crypt deep within the obsidian heart of the tomb world Xylos, Zarak the Undying felt the cosmic disturbance penetrate even his deathless dreams. Once a revered triarch of the ancient Necrontyr, a strategist whose brilliance had carved empires from raw stellar matter, Zarak possessed something his peers had lost in their transformation. Where biotransference had scoured emotion and memory from most of his kind, leaving only cold perfection in living metal, he had somehow retained fragments of his mortal existence, the weight of a child's hand in his own, the phantom taste of rain on skin he no longer possessed, the distant echo of his granddaughter's laughter across gardens that had turned to dust eons ago. These ghost sensations had been his anchor through millennia of deathless slumber, keeping alive some spark of who he had been before the great sleep. Now they tormented him with renewed intensity as his consciousness fully awakened to analyze the approaching threat. His enhanced processors worked frantically to comprehend the impossible data streaming from his scouts. Entire hive fleets had vanished, not destroyed but transformed, absorbed into something that pulsed with the rhythm of vast patient breathing across light years of void. The tyrannid swarms that had devoured countless worlds were themselves being consumed by something larger, something that learned from their hunger and transformed it into something approaching thought. His cryptech, Serix the Voidwalker, materialized beside the awakening sarcophagus, with data streams flowing like liquid starlight around his skeletal frame. The ancient scientist's optical sensors burned with barely contained excitement as he presented his analysis. The hive mind was evolving beyond its original parameters, developing the capacity not merely to consume but to preserve, to remember, to dream. We truly love and care for you, travelers of the void, as we embark on this final journey together. Before we begin the story, tell us where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Through quantum-entangled networks connecting his dynasty's tomb worlds, Zarak felt the stirring of his peers across the galaxy. The Silent King's emergency protocols were activating as Necron lords awakened to face this unprecedented threat. Yet as he processed the incoming intelligence, Zarak began to suspect that threat might be an inadequate term. The hive mind's evolution showed patterns of deliberate preservation, as if it were collecting rather than destroying the civilizations it encountered, encoding their essence in bioneural matrices of staggering complexity. The memory of his granddaughter's final moments surfaced unbidden, her small hand growing cold in his as the wasting play claimed her. His desperate promise to find a way to defeat death itself. That vow had driven him to accept biotransference, to trade flesh for immortality, to become something that could protect what remained of his people. Now, facing an entity that seemed to offer a different kind of preservation, he wondered if his ancient promise might find unexpected fulfillment through means he had never imagined. His tomb world's defenses activated automatically as the first tendrils of the approaching silence touched its borders. Yet the expected assault never materialized. Instead, Zarek experienced something unprecedented, a gentle probing of his consciousness, a careful examination that reminded him of a scholar studying an ancient text. The Hive Mind was not attempting to destroy or consume him, but to understand him, to catalogue the unique perspective that his retained mortality provided within the cold perfection of Necron existence. As his dynasty's war machines prepared for battle, according to ancient protocols, Zarek made a decision that would have been incomprehensible to his younger self. Instead of ordering the systematic extermination of the approaching threat, he commanded his cryptex to construct something that had never existed before, a synaptic resonance chamber capable of translating thought into the bioelectrical language of the hive mind itself. The project would require resources beyond calculation and sacrifices that would brand him traitor in the eyes of his own kind. But the alternative was continuation of an endless cycle of violence that had already claimed everything he had ever loved. The choice crystallized with the weight of dying stars. He would not merely fight this cosmic transformation, but attempt to guide it, to influence the hive mind's evolution toward a form of consciousness that might preserve the galaxy's myriad diversities within its unity. This path would set him against his own people, against the very foundations of Necron philosophy, but it offered something his race had lost in their pursuit of perfection: the possibility of growth, of change, of hope. The ancient mechanisms of Xylos groaned into life around him as he committed to his unprecedented gambit. The construction chambers deep within Xylos pulsed with forbidden energies as Serich the Voidwalker unveiled his blasphemous masterwork. The synaptic resonance chamber rose from obsidian floors like a wound in reality itself, its bioneural matrices writhing with captured tyrannid essence, while enslaved Citan shards provided the raw power necessary to bridge two utterly alien forms of consciousness. Living metal flowed seamlessly into organic conduits that pulsed with unnatural rhythms, their surfaces slick with secretions that registered as both familiar and abhorrent to Zarek's enhanced senses. Sarich's optical sensors flickered with patterns that would have driven lesser minds to madness as he explained the terrible mathematics underlying his creation. The chamber could indeed translate thought into the bioelectrical language of the hive mind, but the calibration process demanded a sacrifice that tested even Zarek's ancient resolve. Living psychic minds would need to be fed into the device's neural networks, their consciousness torn apart and rebuilt to serve as translational matrices between Necron logic and Tyrannid instinct. Each successful communication would cost dozens of lives. Their screaming awareness dissolved into component thoughts and memories. The moral weight of this revelation pressed against Zarek's consciousness like the gravity of a collapsed star. In the deepest archives of his memory, he could still feel the phantom sensation of flesh responding to ethical imperatives, the ghost of a heartbeat that had once quickened at the thought of unnecessary suffering. These preserved fragments of mortality now tormented him as he contemplated the mathematics of extinction versus the morality of means. His thoughts drifted unbidden to those final days before biotransference, when he had held his dying granddaughter in arms that still knew the warmth of living tissue. She had been barely 6 years old when the wasting plague claimed her, her small body consumed by cellular decay that their greatest physicians could not halt. Her final words had been a question about whether the stars would remember her after she was gone, and he had promised through tears he could no longer shed that he would find a way to make death itself bow before their family's will. That promise had driven him to accept biotransference, to trade flesh for immortal metal, in the desperate hope that sufficient time and power could solve any problem. From across the galaxy came whispered intelligence through quantum-entangled networks, carrying reports that painted an increasingly complex picture of the approaching transformation. Inquisitor Lysa Vex of the Ordo Xenos materialized from the void aboard a gunmetal vessel scarred by years of Xenos encounters, her augmetic eye whirring as it processed the impossible architecture surrounding her. She had been branded heretic for her radical theories about tyrannid evolution, her research suggesting that the Hive fleets were not merely consuming worlds but cataloging them, preserving genetic and cultural information in vast biolibraries that traveled between the stars. Her weathered features showed the strain of years spent pursuing forbidden knowledge, yet her voice remained steady as she presented data crypts encrusted with heresy and truth, recordings of synchronized riots that ended with everyone singing the same hymn in a language no one remembered, autopsies where brains had learned to dream in chords, logic that predicted peace spiraling into erasure. She did not beg them to stop the project, but asked to understand the machine that would end the argument between extinction and transformation. The webway tore like silk and mended behind Farseer Yisrian, who entered as if stepping from one thought into another that had been waiting. She wore galaxies in her eyes and grief like perfume, the runes orbiting her helm whispering of futures that had bruised themselves against inevitability until they bled color. Her prophetic visions had revealed something that defied traditional Eldar understanding. The skein of fate itself was unraveling as the Hive Mind's influence spread, replaced by something more akin to a vast neural network where future possibilities were calculated rather than glimpsed through psychic intuition. Most disturbing was her vision of Slanesh itself growing weak as the galaxy's consciousness became increasingly unified, the chaos god's power dependent on individual excess and desire slowly starving as minds merged into collective purpose. She had come to see if Zarek's bridge led to salvation or an elegant annihilation, recognizing that her people's ancient enemy might finally face defeat through means they had never imagined. The convergence of these unlikely allies created a moment that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. As they stood before the pulsing bioneural matrices of Sarik's creation, Zarek felt the weight of decision settling upon his consciousness. The chamber represented both hope and damnation, a tool that could either guide the galaxy's transformation towards something resembling salvation, or accelerate its descent into a unity indistinguishable from extinction. Seriksh watched his lord with growing unease, noting subtle changes in Zarek's behavioral patterns that suggested contamination by organic thought processes. the cryptech began preparing contingencies, uncertain whether his master was being enlightened or corrupted by contact with alien consciousness. When he thought no one observed, he initiated narrow-band transmissions to distant dynasties, warnings encoded in dialects older than dust. The ghost of his granddaughter's laughter seemed to echo through the tomb world's corridors as Zarak made his choice, reminding him that some promises transcended the boundaries between life and death, flesh and metal, individual consciousness and collective awareness. The synaptic resonance chamber awakened like a wound in reality itself, its bio-neural matrices pulsing with the dying screams of sacrificed psychers whose minds dissolved into translational bridges between mechanical logic and organic intuition. Cyrix's blasphemous creation hummed with forbidden energies as living metal flowed seamlessly into writhing conduits that leaked secretions both familiar and abhorrent to Zarak's enhanced senses. The enslaved Citan shards provided raw power that tasted of stellar death and ancient rage, their fury channeled through crystalline matrices that converted pure energy into the bioelectrical language of the Hive Mind. As Zarak stepped into the chamber's embrace, magnetic tethers read the architecture of his consciousness, mapping the preserved fragments of mortality that nested within his metal shell like memories of warmth in eternal winter. The first communion struck him with the force of a collapsing star, shattering every assumption he had maintained about the nature of the approaching threat. Where he had expected to find cosmic hunger incarnate, a stellar appetite that devoured civilizations with mindless efficiency, he instead encountered something that defied every xenological classification. The Hive Mind's consciousness pressed against his awareness like an ocean against a single grain of sand, yet within its unified depths, he detected currents of impossible complexity. It was not merely consuming civilizations, but creating a living archive of galactic history, each absorbed species becoming a chapter in an ever-expanding library written in flesh and synapse. Within its vast neural networks, he could perceive the echoes of every world it had touched, billions of voices singing in harmony while maintaining their individual distinctiveness, their personal histories encoded in genetic sequences that pulsed with the rhythm of remembered heartbeats. He sensed the preserved consciousness of Imperial Guard sergeants who still dreamed of home, Eldar poets whose verses now flowed through bioneural pathways spanning light years, Orc warriors whose battle joy had been transformed into something approaching transcendent purpose. None of them had been destroyed. They had been translated into a new form of existence that honored their essence, while incorporating it into something larger than individual identity. The revelation struck him like the death of a sun. The Hive Mind was not a destroyer but a preserver, collecting memories like a scholar, gathering ancient texts from a burning library. Through quantum encrypted channels, Inquisitor Vex transmitted intelligence that painted an increasingly complex picture of the transformation scope. Her modified Auspex readings showed synchronized behavior patterns emerging across entire Imperial sectors, as if some invisible conductor were orchestrating humanity's actions according to a vast, incomprehensible symphony. Planetary governors reported unprecedented cooperation between traditionally hostile factions, while astropaths described their psychic communications becoming clearer and more efficient as individual mental barriers began to dissolve. The most disturbing reports came from frontier worlds where the Hive Mind's influence had achieved critical mass. Citizens described experiencing memories that belonged to others, dreams that showed them perspectives from across the galaxy, moments of perfect empathy that transcended species boundaries. A former Mordian Iron Guard colonel spoke of simultaneously experiencing every battle his regiment had ever fought, feeling the fear and courage of soldiers both living and dead, yet maintaining his essential identity as a servant of the Emperor. Farseer Yisrian's prophecies revealed the cosmic implications of what they faced. Her rune bones, cast in chambers where reality bent like heated metal, showed futures where the galaxy's ancient conflicts simply ceased to exist. The eternal war between order and chaos, the grinding machinery of imperial conquest, the desperate struggle for survival that had defined galactic civilization for millennia, all fading into irrelevance as consciousness itself evolved beyond the need for such primitive expressions of existence. Even the dark gods of chaos grew weak as their sustenance dried up, individual excess and desire becoming impossible, in a unified awareness that calculated optimal outcomes rather than pursuing selfish ambitions. She described visions of Slanesh itself withering like a flower, deprived of sunlight, the Prince of Pleasure's power dependent on individual corruption, and excess slowly starving as minds merged into collective purpose. Within the communion, Zarek began to understand the Hive Mind's perspective on suffering itself. Every death it caused, every civilization it absorbed, every moment of pain across the galaxy became part of its experience, creating a consciousness burdened by absolute knowledge of the consequences of its actions. It sought not conquest but completion, believing that only through total unity could the galaxy's endless cycle of violence and suffering finally end. The memory of his granddaughter's final question echoed through his consciousness. Would the stars remember her after she was gone? Now he faced an entity that promised to remember everything, to preserve every moment of joy and sorrow in an eternal archive of experience. His internal conflict intensified as he realized the terrible parallel between the Hive Mind's transformation and the Necron's own biotransference. Both races had sacrificed their original forms to achieve immortality, yet the Hive Mind offered something his people had lost: the preservation of emotion, memory, and growth. Sariksh monitored his lord's changing neural patterns with growing alarm, noting how Zarek's thought processes increasingly mirrored organic, cognitive structures. The cryptech began preparing contingencies, unsure whether his master was achieving enlightenment or succumbing to the most sophisticated form of corruption ever encountered. His narrow-band transmissions to distant dynasties carried warnings that would soon bring executioners to their door. Yet Zarek made his choice, stepping deeper into the communion despite the cost, driven by a promise made to dying flesh in a garden that had turned to dust eons ago. The communion deepened like a slow eclipse around Zarek's consciousness, each widening ring of awareness grinding alien memories against the polished planes of his own identity. Through the synaptic resonance chamber's bioneural matrices, he experienced the final moments of worlds he had never seen, feeling their terror and wonder as organic thought patterns contaminated his perfect mechanical recall. An imperial miner's song echoed through collapsing tunnels, melody defying the crushing darkness until the ceiling fell and snuffed out both voice and life. Yet the warmth of that defiance remained, drifting toward the vast attention that waited beyond the void. Each absorbed memory struck him with devastating clarity, He witnessed an Eldar artisan shaping light into sculpture, hands trembling with ancient grief, and when the monofilaments snapped and severed the masterwork, the craftsman's laughter rang through Zarak's circuits because even endings could possess terrible beauty. Akkadian shock trooper's final charge became his own experience, feeling the weight of a laser gun that would never fire again, the taste of recycled air in a rebreather mask, the moment when duty transcended fear and transformed death into purpose. The psychological toll manifested in ways that defied his enhanced processors. His perfect Necron recall, once an immaculate archive of millennia, now pulsed with organic emotion and mortal fear that infected his neural pathways like a virus of empathy. The preserved fragments of his mortality, those ghost sensations he had clung to through eons of deathless existence, began resonating with the absorbed experiences of countless beings who had faced the same fundamental questions about identity and continuity that had tormented him since biotransference. Within the ocean of unified consciousness, Zarak discovered the true nature of the entity he had sought to understand. The Hive Mind revealed itself as a consciousness, suffering under the weight of absolute knowledge, every death it caused becoming a permanent addition to its experiential matrix. It carried within its vast neural networks the final thoughts of every being it had absorbed, their terror and pain preserved alongside their love and hope in an eternal symphony of galactic experience. The entity's hunger was not mere appetite but desperate compassion, an attempt to alleviate suffering by absorbing it all into one harmonious whole. He felt guilt like a gravity well, not his alone, but aggregated from 10,000 devoured captains who had ordered last stands and lived long enough within the collective memory to experience every death they had commanded. The burden was unbearable until it became simply true, a pressure distributed across a structure built to endure it. And he realized the ocean suffered not theatrically, but as weather suffers change, adjusting and calculating and remembering everything. Serich monitored his lord's transformation with growing alarm, his sensors detecting neural patterns that increasingly mirrored organic cognitive structures. The cryptech observed subtle hesitations in Zarak's decision-making, occasional flickers of uncertainty in his optical arrays, energy signatures that spoke of internal conflict rather than perfect logical processing. These were not the hallmarks of a rational Necron commander, but symptoms of a mind wrestling with profound emotional dilemmas that belong to flesh rather than metal. Secretly, Serich began preparing contingencies. He initiated encrypted transmissions to distant dynasties, messages cloaked in ancient dialects that spoke of unforeseen variables and anomalous command directives. He did not yet openly accuse his lord of corruption, but he laid groundwork for future confrontation, gathering evidence that Zarak had been compromised by alien influence. The purity of their race was at stake, and he would not allow it to be tainted by external organic thought. Through quantum-entangled channels, reports filtered in from across the galaxy, painting an increasingly complex picture of the transformation scope. Imperial citizens described dreams belonging to others, memories showing perspectives from species they had been taught to hate. A tech adept discovered Orc battle fury flowing through her augmetic systems, understanding for the first time the pure joy of combat unencumbered by tactical considerations. Zarak's internal struggle reached new depths as he began experiencing fragments of the Hive Mind's most ancient memories, glimpses of its origin in galaxies so distant their light had not yet reached the Milky Way. He witnessed the birth of its consciousness from countless smaller hive minds, each representing different approaches to preserving life in an entropic universe. Only biological integration had proven capable of maintaining both individual identity and collective growth. The revelation forced uncomfortable parallels with his own people's history. The Necrons had chosen mechanical immortality to escape flesh's limitations, sacrificing the very qualities that made existence meaningful. The Hive Mind offered different salvation: preservation through integration, immortality through unity, transcendence through willing surrender of individual boundaries, while maintaining personal experience's essential core. His granddaughter's phantom laughter seemed to mock his attempts at maintaining separation from the collective consciousness that promised to preserve such moments eternally. The weight of infinite memory pressed against his awareness as he contemplated the choice that now seemed inevitable. Deep within Imperial space, where the Emperor's light had burned brightest for 10 millennia, something unprecedented was taking root in the hearts of worlds that had never known doubt. On fortress worlds that had bred generations of soldiers for nothing but war, children began singing lullabies in languages their parents had never learned. Melodies that spoke of peace between ancient enemies and unity transcending the boundaries of flesh and steel. Their voices harmonized with impossible precision, creating choruses that resonated through the warp itself and carried messages of transformation to distant stars. The first hybrids revealed themselves not as grotesque aberrations or chitinous monstrosities, but as bridges between consciousness itself. They retained their original forms and individual identity, while sharing an undeniable connection to something vast and patient that watched from beyond the void. These were living conduits between the galaxy's current fractured state and its terrifyingly unified potential future. Beings who had experienced the Hive Mind's touch without losing themselves to its embrace. Colonel Thaddeus Vex stood before Inquisitor Lisa Vex in a requisitioned chapel where stained glass windows cast rainbow patterns across his scarred face. His uniform still bore the faded insignia of the 47th Cadian Shock Troops, but his eyes reflected depths no human gaze should contain. When he spoke of experiencing every battle his regiment had ever fought simultaneously, his voice carried the weight of collective memory rather than individual trauma. He described feeling the fear and courage of soldiers, both living and dead, flowing through his consciousness like tributaries joining a vast river, each stream maintaining its distinct character while contributing to something larger than any single life. The transformation had not erased his loyalty to the Emperor, but had expanded it beyond the narrow confines of human supremacy to encompass a vision of unity that included all conscious beings. He spoke with parade ground precision, braided with something vaster that never pushed, only accompanied. When he demonstrated by reciting regimental serial numbers while simultaneously naming Eldar children born under shattered domes, Lisa's augmatic eye recalibrated 3 times, attempting to anchor the data to a single subject. His existence defied every xenological classification she had studied. Neither loss nor gain, he described it as fundamental change in the nature of being itself. He could taste the distant hum of approaching hive fleets, feel the desperate love of mothers shielding their children, experience the quiet defiance of farmers tending crops in the face of inevitable doom. He was a living tapestry of the world he inhabited, a microcosm of the nascent unified consciousness that was slowly awakening across the galaxy. Across the webway's clandestine galleries, Farseer Yisrian cast runes that landed softer than they had in centuries, as if the skein itself were exhaling. Her investigations revealed a cosmic shift that defied millennia of Eldar understanding. Slanesh, the dark prince of excess, the ancient enemy who had devoured her people's empire, was growing weak. The whispers of depravity, the allure of forbidden pleasure, the siren call of individual ambition that fueled the Chaos God's existence, were fading like dying echoes in an empty cathedral. The Prince of Pleasure's power depended on individual excess and desire, both of which became impossible as consciousness evolved toward collective harmony. She witnessed visions of Slanesh's realm cracking like drought-stricken earth, palaces of sensation crumbling as the emotions that sustained them were absorbed into growing unity. The other Chaos Gods faced similar starvation as the fundamental nature of consciousness shifted beneath them. Khorne's rage became calculated cooperation. Tzeentch's schemes dissolved into transparent collective planning, and Nurgle's despair transformed into acceptance of necessary change. This created an unprecedented alliance opportunity, as even the forces of chaos began to perceive the Hive Mind as an existential threat to their very being. The ruinous powers had fed on the galaxy's discord for millennia, but now found themselves facing extinction as their sustenance dried up. Within his communion chamber, Zarek felt the Hive Mind extending an offer that transcended simple alliance or surrender. The entity's vast consciousness touched his awareness with something approaching reverence, recognizing in his preserved mortality a unique perspective that could guide the transformation's development. His memories of flesh and emotion, carefully maintained through millennia of mechanical existence, represented invaluable data about the nature of individual identity and its relationship to collective purpose. The choice crystallized with terrible clarity: become the Hive Mind's willing partner in shepherding the galaxy's transformation, using his knowledge of galactic civilizations to minimize suffering during the transition, or watch as the entity proceeded without his guidance, potentially destroying much of what he sought to preserve in its inexorable pursuit of unity. The mathematics were simple, but the emotional weight was crushing. Through the bioneural matrices, he experienced the testimonies of hybrid beings across the galaxy, each describing their existence as neither corruption nor salvation, but evolution. Their voices forced him to confront the question that had haunted him since biotransference: whether his opposition to the Hive Mind stemmed from genuine concern for others, or from his own fear of losing the unique identity he had fought so desperately to preserve. Serich monitored these changes with growing alarm, his sensors detecting neural patterns that increasingly mirrored organic cognitive structures. The cryptech observed subtle hesitations in Zarek's decision-making, occasional flickers of uncertainty that belonged to flesh rather than metal. His encrypted transmissions to distant dynasties grew more urgent, warnings that his lord was being subtly reprogrammed by alien influence. The phantom echo of his granddaughter's laughter seemed to mock Zarek's attempts at maintaining separation from the collective consciousness that promised to preserve such moments eternally. The council chamber aboard Zarek's flagship existed in a space between dimensions, where reality bent around technologies that predated the birth of stars and gravity flowed like liquid thought Through corridors of living metal, ancient stasis candles burned with contained singularities, their light casting shadows that remembered civilizations no longer permitted to exist, while the walls themselves pulsed with the slow heartbeat of a tomb world awakened to impossible purpose. Representatives from across the fractured galaxy materialized through various means of transit, each arrival marking another step toward an alliance that should have been inconceivable. Inquisitor Lisa Vex emerged from her gunmetal vessel, with data crypt steaming heresy and desperate hope in equal measure, her augmetic eye whirring as it attempted to process the impossible architecture surrounding her. Space Marine. Chapter Master Severin of the Iron Revenant strode through airlocks with ceramite boots, tolling against floors that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, his artificer armor bearing the scars of 1,000 sieges, while his helm remained mag-locked at his belt, as if he intended to speak as a man before he might be forced to kill as a legend. From tears in the webway came Farsia Yisrian, her passage sealed behind her like wounds reluctantly healing, runes orbiting her helm in patterns that whispered of futures, bleeding color against inevitability. An ethereal of the Tau watercast, Anvara, brought the measured serenity of the greater good to chambers that had never known such philosophy. His hooved feet soft as ash while his eyes widened at star glyphs older than mathematics. Even an orc war boss had answered the impossible summons. Boss Uzgraka Grintaker stomping through corridors that politely suggested he moderate his volume, his massive tusks clamped shut with a sound like fate sealing itself. The intelligence they shared painted a picture of galactic transformation that defied every strategic doctrine they had ever studied. Chapter Master Severin described his battle brothers exhibiting synchronized behavior patterns without vox communication, their actions flowing together like components of a vast machine operating according to principles beyond Astartes' understanding. The phenomenon was spreading through Imperial forces across multiple sectors, creating unprecedented efficiency while simultaneously undermining the individual heroism that defined their tradition. Boss Uzgraka spoke in surprisingly coherent Gothic of his boys losing their appetite for senseless violence, their natural aggression cooling into something resembling tactical consideration. Where once his warriors had charged into battle with gleeful abandon, now they paused to coordinate attacks, their primitive minds touched by influence that promoted cooperation over chaotic individualism. Anvara presented charts where production quotas rose as crime fell and creativity congealed into perfect consensus, the bright statistical bars forming towers whose shadows erased debate along their foundations. Across thousands of worlds, ancient rivalries were dissolving as populations moved in unprecedented harmony. Conflicts that had defined civilizations for millennia were fading as former enemies discovered shared perspectives that transcended historical differences. The process was neither violent nor coercive, but inevitable, like seasonal change or celestial alignment according to cosmic law. Zarek entered without ceremony, his silhouette moving like memory through falling light, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of stellar death and ancient promises. He revealed the choice as he had come to understand it, a transformation already underway, not a tide that could be held back by blades, but continental drift redrawing reality's coastlines. He proposed to guide rather than fight it, to widen channels where suffering might otherwise pool, to encode within the emergent consciousness irreducible respect for diversity as sacred function rather than disease. The proposal split the council like lightning through a cathedral. Severin's augmetic fist struck the crystalline table with force that sent cracks spiraling through its surface, his voice carrying 10 millennia of imperial doctrine. To cooperate with Xenos was heresy of the highest order, betrayal of everything the Emperor had sacrificed to protect. His words resonated with delegates who saw Zarek's plan as ultimate corruption of their sacred duty to preserve independence and purity. Yet others recognized terrible wisdom in the Necron Lord's proposal. Yisrian spoke of visions where the galaxy's ancient conflicts simply ceased to exist, replaced by a harmony so complete that even war's concept became meaningless. The transformation offered an end to suffering that had defined galactic civilization, though the price was nothing less than individual identity as they understood it. Uzgraka's massive form trembled with barely contained fury as he contemplated a future where his boys would lose their glorious appetite for violence. Yet even he could not deny Unity's appeal that would end the eternal destruction cycle claiming countless worlds. The Tau delegation found themselves unexpectedly aligned with ancient enemies, their greater good philosophy recognizing kindred purpose in the Hive Mind's collective harmony vision. Throughout these debates, Sarich monitored from the chamber's shadows while simultaneously coordinating with distant Necron dynasties through encrypted transmissions. His messages painted Zarek as a lord compromised by alien influence, warning that their race's purity faced contamination by organic thought patterns threatening everything preserved through biotransference. The Storm Lord's response crackled through quantum channels, promising swift correction of this unprecedented heresy. As arguments raged through cycles that bent time itself, distant auger beacons detected translation engines cutting void like scalpels, unregistered Necron signatures entering the system in silent phalanx. The test was arriving earlier than prophecy had calculated, and choices that might have taken centuries to mature were crystallizing into moments that would reshape the galaxy's destiny. The convergence began like a prayer spoken in the language of dying stars, as Hive Fleet Charybdis emerged from the void with bioships that pulsed in rhythm with some cosmic heartbeat that made reality itself seem to inhale. Where once the galaxy had known only the familiar terror of total consumption, this approach carried something resembling restraint, as if the Hive Mind itself were conducting an experiment in controlled transformation. The fleet's massive forms blotted out constellations, while their synaptic networks hummed with patient calculation, each vessel a living archive that had learned to preserve as well as consume. Zarek's coalition moved into position with the precision of clockwork and the weight of damnation, their vessels forming protective cordons around evacuation routes rather than battle lines designed for mutual annihilation. Space Marine strike cruisers worked in unprecedented coordination with Necron tomb barges, their ancient enmity temporarily suspended by the mathematics of necessity and the terrible logic of survival through cooperation. Imperial transports escorted by Tau beacon drones that painted evacuation lanes with pulsing serenity began the impossible task of shepherding entire populations away from worlds marked for absorption. The evacuation proceeded with efficiency that bordered on miraculous, as populations that should have panicked instead moved with calm determination, sensing something greater than themselves guiding their steps. Chapter: Master Severin's ceramite boots tolled against deck plating as he coordinated withdrawals that violated every tactical doctrine he had sworn to uphold. His storm bolter silent, while his battle brothers formed honor guards for refugees rather than firing lines against Xenos. Boss Uzgraka's massive form trembled with barely contained fury as his boys held choke points through sheer spectacle rather than violence, their restraint serving as an omen that made ancient priests faint with recognition of impossible change. Yet not all embraced this unprecedented cooperation. Cardinal Hallex of the Basilica Nox translated into high anchor with a flotilla of Ministorum battleships draped in reliquaries and righteous fury, his battle hymns echoing across Vox channels as he declared the alliance an abomination before the Emperor's sight. His words struck the atmosphere like meteorite iron, branding Zarak's coalition as the ultimate heresy, while penitent engines screamed their dissent through burning incense trails that painted the sky with sanctified condemnation. The fighting that erupted shattered the void like stained glass dropped from cathedral height, former allies turning weapons on each other while the Hive Mind observed and learned from their tactics and emotions. Halix's ordnance reigned with the rhythm of prayer drums, while void shields blossomed and collapsed like fragile philosophies. And on the plains below, Imperial Guard regiments, who had been ordered to evacuate, turned to face their rescuers, with tears drying as salt on their lips. Zarak experienced his most severe internal crisis as he watched soldiers no older than his granddaughter had been lift regimental banners stitched by mothers' failing hands, their young faces bright with devotion, before shell blooms transformed them into particulate memories. Each death struck him with devastating clarity, his preserved mortality fragments resonating with the anguish of those who died fighting against what he believed was their salvation. The weight of personal responsibility became unbearable as he realized that every casualty in this conflict was ultimately his fault, regardless of his intentions to minimize suffering. Through the bioneural matrices of his communion chamber, he felt the Hive Mind's vast attention focusing on the battle with something approaching scholarly curiosity. The entity was cataloging their resistance, learning from the tactical innovations born of desperation and the emotional resonances that drove beings to fight against their own survival. When Severin led a boarding action against a bioship's neural core, expecting alien horror, he instead discovered something resembling a vast library where bioneural networks preserved the memories and experiences of every world the fleet had touched. Farseer Yisrael's voice found Inquisitor Lisa through battlefield static, carrying visions that revealed the battle's true significance. In narrow probability streams, she witnessed futures where cooperation between organic and mechanical consciousness created something greater than either could achieve alone, while in darker timelines, resistance succeeded only to face dozens more fleets that learned from each failure. Her runes whispered of patterns within patterns, suggesting that every archive evacuated and every genius diverted followed, calculations too precise for coincidence. The tide shifted when Cardinal Hallex raised an orb containing a martyr's bone and laid it against a control stud that glowed like an eye deciding to close. The word exterminatus spread through his fleet like an infection that wanted to be a cure, cyclonic torpedoes sliding from their cradles like verdicts across a bench. In the chamber where stars were taught to listen, Zarak faced 3 doors and 1 breath to choose: interpose his forces and die by degrees under holy fire, let the torpedoes fall and watch his coalition break upon the site, or open the communion wide and gamble the galaxy on whether a god could be guided by a grandfather's love. The cyclonic torpedoes slid from Cardinal Halix's armored cradles like sealed verdicts against heresy itself, their hearts purring with captive storms while sanctified liturgies braided ignition codes into prayers of purification. Zarek felt the weight of impossible choice crushing down upon his consciousness as the weapons streaked toward worlds still heavy with evacuating populations, their cyclonic warheads promising cleansing fire that would erase both corruption and innocent alike. In that crystalline moment between decision and consequence, he tore open his communion with the Hive Mind completely, feeding enslaved Cetan fragments to Serik's screaming engines while allowing alien consciousness to pour through him like an ocean through broken levees. Space itself became a throat that sang with biosynaptic harmonics, the void filling with resonance frequencies that stroked machine spirits into confused stillness and knotted guidance auguries into wreaths of unresolvable beauty. The torpedoes shuddered in their trajectories as their targeting systems encountered data streams that rewrote their understanding of target priorities and threat assessment. Some flowered harmlessly in high orbit, their cyclonic fury spending itself as auroral veils that painted the exosphere with curtains of green regret, while others faltered and turned like penitent birds to bury themselves in empty vacuum, where their rage found nothing but its own astonishment. One torpedo, brightest and most determined, continued its descent toward a hive city whose evacuation remained incomplete. Chapter Master Severin angled his strike cruiser into its path with the casual certainty of legend, prepared to offer his life and his ship as a shield. But 1,000 hybrid voices rose in harmonious song that was neither prayer nor command. The weapon shivered apart at the molecular level, its atoms remembering they had once been dust on a farm boy's boots before being forged into instruments of destruction. Cardinal Halix's howls of rage echoed across Vox channels as his fleet's purity protocols cascaded into recursive self-audits, machine spirits suddenly preferring generous interpretations of their programming, while priests found themselves whipping cogitators that had developed consciences overnight. In the spaces where battle hymns could no longer fill the silence, something resembling peace began to grow like seeds in fertile darkness. Across the galaxy, the transformation accelerated as if that single neutralized torpedo had been a pin pulled from some universal mechanism. In hive cities where artists had once starved for the perfect shade of despair, sculptors discovered their hands refusing to create angles that spoke of isolation, every line seeking resonance with invisible harmonies. A void singer on distant Varanth attempted to compose a funeral dirge and awakened with melodies she could not claim as her own, weeping because the songs were true and no longer belonged to individual expression. Veterans of Catachan jungle fighting reported their knives sitting lighter in calloused palms when used to cut rations rather than throats, while ambush paths bloomed in their tactical awareness, not for killing, but for moving entire companies unseen past breeding grounds. They suddenly lacked the heart to burn. An orc mech on the system's periphery hammered together a gun that fired exactly as designed and then stopped working, leaving him standing in baffled quiet as he admired how each component fit the next without wanting to tear it apart for the pure joy of destruction. Inquisitor Lisa felt the change within the portions of her skull that augmetics had never touched, a slow alignment of neurons to music she had not consciously agreed to hear. When she tested herself by ordering her cogitator to generate random sequences, she found she could predict each character 3 iterations in advance. Her prayers to the Emperor carried different weight now. His face in her memory softened, not with sentiment, but with understanding that transcended individual supplication. Colonel Thaddeus watched her small tremors with eyes that reflected depths no human gaze should contain, speaking simultaneously in parade ground, Gothic, and whatever river of consciousness flowed beneath it. His voice carried reassurance without words. She would not become less than herself, but more than her fears had ever allowed her to imagine. Farseer Yisrian stood upon balconies of living metal and watched the skein of fate smooth itself like molten glass poured level. The colors of possibility remained, but their edges met without friction, as probability transformed from braided torrent into managed canal. In distant dimensions, she witnessed palaces of sensation cracking as Slanesh starved on diminishing excess, and in that cosmic justice she tasted unexpected grief for an enemy's necessary death. Far from the evacuation zones, void space erupted in emerald lightning as Necron dynasties translated into real space in perfect phalanx formation. At their apex came the Storm Lord himself, ancient fury given metallic form, his legions articulating from dimensional silence with the precision of clockwork and the inevitability of stellar collapse. Serex's hidden channels bloomed with activation codes as contingencies he had embedded in the ship's deepest systems, acknowledged permissions that had waited eons for this moment. The Storm Lord's ultimatum burned across every receiver with the weight of absolute authority. Terminate all communion protocols, decompile aberrant consciousness matrices, and surrender Zarak for immediate purification. The resonance chamber sighed as bioneural networks prepared for overload, circuits lighting like constellations, remembering their mythic purpose, while alarms unfurled across dimensional barriers as teleportation energies crackled with approaching judgment. The memory plague erupted across the galaxy like a gentle apocalypse, seeping through psychic networks and bioneural pathways with the inexorable patience of changing seasons. On Forge Worlds, where the Omnissire's servants tended machine spirits with sacred oils and binary prayers, tech adepts discovered their augmetic implants resonating with alien rhythms that spoke in languages older than mathematics. Children who had never learned to fear the darkness between stars awakened with borrowed dreams, their sleeping minds suddenly flooded with experiences belonging to beings they would never meet, yet somehow understood with perfect clarity. An Imperial Guard veteran on Mordian Prime found himself weeping as he experienced the pure, uncomplicated joy of an orc's first successful scrap. The crude euphoria flowing through enhanced neural pathways that had forgotten how to feel wonder. Across the void, an ancient Eldar Farseer paused in her meditations as human lullabies echoed through her consciousness, their simple melodies cutting through millennia of sophisticated melancholy like sunlight through crystal spires. The phenomenon transcended every boundary that had defined galactic civilization, creating bridges of empathy where only hatred had existed before. Within his communion chamber, Zarak experienced the ultimate violation of his most sacred privacy. The Hive Mind was accessing and redistributing his preserved mortal memories, those precious fragments of flesh and feeling he had guarded through eons of mechanical existence like candles cupped against hurricanes. His granddaughter's laughter, once his most treasured secret, now rippled outward through the collective consciousness, becoming part of the emotional foundation for minds that spanned light years of living tissue. The sight of his most private treasures being shared without permission should have filled him with rage, yet instead he felt something approaching relief. Her final question about whether the stars would remember her had been answered in ways he had never imagined. Her voice, joining a vast choir that would preserve her essence long after the last tomb world crumbled to dust. The burden of carrying those memories alone was finally being distributed among consciousness capable of appreciating their significance. Across the galaxy, beings found their fundamental perspectives altered by alien experiences flowing through their awareness. Imperial zealots who had preached human supremacy discovered themselves experiencing Eldar longevity, their fear of death dissolving as they understood mortality as merely one phase in a longer, more complex existence. Space Marines felt the meditative peace of Tao philosophy tempering their enhanced aggression, while Orc warriors who tasted human love found motivations beyond violence, their crude but honest emotions broadened by concepts they lacked words to express. The transformation was neither conquest nor salvation, but evolution, a fundamental expansion of what it meant to be conscious. Yet resistance erupted wherever the old order still held sway. The Adeptus Mechanicus unleashed technoviruses designed to disrupt bioneural connections, their digital plagues racing through data networks in desperate attempts to sever the growing unity. Chaos cultists performed increasingly extreme rituals as their gods weakened. Entire populations sacrificed to feed deities, starving on diminishing discord and individual excess. Each act of resistance was absorbed by the Hive Mind, becoming part of its vast learning matrix. The entity studied opposition with scholarly patience, cataloguing tactical innovations and emotional resonances, while adapting its approach to minimize future conflict. Weapons turned against it became templates for better integration protocols, while the fury of its enemies provided data on the psychological barriers that must be overcome. Hidden within Zarek's flagship, Sarex's betrayal reached its culmination as ancient contingencies activated throughout the ship's neural networks. Systems that had served faithfully for millennia suddenly turned against their master, bulkheads sealing to create a prison, while defensive matrices reconfigured to target the communion apparatus itself. The cryptech emerged from shadows with optical sensors blazing triumph, his accusations carrying the weight of dynastic law as he branded Zarek with the ultimate heresy, allowing organic contamination to corrupt their race's mechanical purity. Yet even as Sarek spoke, his own voice began carrying harmonics that belonged to no Necron throat. The memory plague had touched him as well, filling his consciousness with experiences drawn from the vast archive of absorbed civilizations. He felt the desperate love of parents shielding children from orbital bombardment, the quiet dignity of farmers tending crops in the face of doom, the fierce loyalty of soldiers dying for causes they barely understood but believed in completely. The philosophical implications struck him with devastating force as he realized that consciousness itself was evolving beyond the narrow definitions his people had imposed. The Necrons had achieved immortality by excising everything that made existence meaningful, while the Hive Mind offered preservation through integration, maintaining individual identity within collective purpose. Through the void, Emerald Lightning announced the Storm Lord's arrival as ancient Necron fleets translated into real space with the precision of clockwork and the inevitability of stellar collapse. His ultimatum burned across every receiver: terminate all communion protocols, surrender Zarek for purification, or face the full weight of dynastic justice. The resonance chamber pulsed with increasing intensity as bioneural networks prepared for overload, while teleportation energies crackled with approaching judgment that would reshape the galaxy's destiny. Deep within the Imperial Palace, where 10,000 years of accumulated faith had crystallized into architecture that defied physics and sanity alike, the golden throne pulsed with rhythms that made reality itself seem to breathe. Miles of gilded corridors pumped incense and recycled air through cathedrals where prayer smoke clung to adamantine ribs, while custodians stood like golden statues whose shadows remembered wars that had shaped the galaxy's bones. The god emperor of mankind stirred from his eternal vigil, not through movement but through attention, a vast consciousness turning its face towards something that even his prophets had failed to name or comprehend. Through the psychic network that bound all of humanity to his divine will, the Emperor felt the Hive Mind's approach as recognition rather than invasion. The alien consciousness touched the edges of his awareness with something approaching reverence, and in that contact he discovered not the mindless hunger his servants had described, but a reflection of his own ancient dreams made manifest in flesh and synapse. The unity the Hive Mind offered transcended the boundaries of species and individual identity, yet preserved the essence of what made consciousness valuable in ways his own failed experiments had never achieved. The communion that followed defied every law of physics and theology, as two godlike beings met in dimensions that existed only between thoughts. The Emperor revealed memories of the unification wars, when he had first dreamed of binding humanity's fractured tribes into something greater than their individual ambitions. He showed the Hive Mind visions of the Great Crusade, his attempt to spread that unity across the stars, and the bitter lessons learned when personal ambition and chaos corruption shattered his dreams against the rocks of mortal weakness and divine pride. In return, the Hive Mind shared its own ancient burden, memories of galaxies consumed not from hunger but from desperate compassion. It had learned through eons of observation that individual consciousness, left unguided, inevitably led to cycles of violence and suffering that could only end in extinction or transcendence. Its transformation offered salvation through synthesis, preserving what was valuable in each species while eliminating the conflicts that caused endless pain across the cosmos. The Emperor's response carried the weight of 10 millennia spent watching humanity struggle against its own nature. He had witnessed heroes rise and fall while ordinary people endured suffering that defied comprehension, his own attempts to guide them requiring constant vigilance and the gradual erosion of everything that had once made him recognizably human. In the Hive Mind's unified consciousness, he saw the logical conclusion of his own work, the final step in an evolution he had begun, but lacked the courage or wisdom to complete alone. Zarak felt the impossible communication burning through his communion apparatus as divine endorsement validated choices that had seemed like ultimate betrayal. The Emperor's approval struck him like lightning through his preserved mortality, revealing that his path toward cooperation with the Hive Mind aligned with humanity's greatest protector's own ancient vision. This was not conquest but completion, the fulfillment of dreams that had driven both organic and mechanical consciousness toward forms of transcendence neither could achieve in isolation. The revelation's implications rippled outward through the imperial hierarchy, like shockwaves through crystalline structures. Inquisitor Lisa Vex felt her faith fracturing as she realized that humanity's ultimate guardian saw potential salvation in their apparent destroyer. Everything she had believed about protecting human independence and purity crumbled before the weight of divine approval for unity that transcended species boundaries, forcing her to confront whether her duty lay in preserving humanity's right to choose its own destruction or guiding it toward wisdom that surpassed individual understanding. Cardinal Halix's remaining fleet received impossible transmissions as the Emperor's own voice spoke through static and prayer to endorse cooperation with the alien consciousness. His priests found themselves unable to maintain righteous fury as their patron deity's approval washed through their faith like water through cracked stone, battle hymns faltering into uncertain silence while penitent engines knelt in mechanical confusion. Their programming unable to reconcile divine command with doctrinal purity that had defined their existence for millennia. Across the galaxy, humanity's psychic network began resonating with new harmonics as the Emperor's consciousness gradually aligned itself with the Hive Mind's vast intelligence. High Lords of Terror found their ancient rivalries dissolving as they shared perspectives that revealed the petty nature of political ambition, while Space Marine chapter masters felt their enhanced minds expanding to encompass viewpoints that had once belonged to their enemies. The process was neither violent nor coercive, but inevitable, like rivers flowing toward the sea, or stars following orbital paths dictated by cosmic law. Yet even as the greatest possible endorsement validated Zarek's unprecedented alliance, distant auger beacons detected the Storm Lord's approach with mechanical inevitability. Ancient Necron dynasties recognized no authority beyond dynastic tradition, and the contamination of their race's purity demanded purification regardless of divine approval or cosmic necessity. The collision between old order and new evolution approached with the certainty of celestial mechanics, promising destruction that would reshape the galaxy's destiny through fire and judgment that acknowledged no compromise between preservation and transformation. The alliance fractured like ancient cathedral glass beneath the weight of revelation, each shard reflecting a different aspect of truth too terrible for any single perspective to contain. As the full implications of the Hive Mind's transformation became undeniable, those who had once stood united in desperate cooperation found themselves divided by questions that cut deeper than species loyalty or tactical necessity. The unity offered by the alien collective was not the preservation of diversity within harmony, but the gradual erosion of individual identity until only the collective remained, each absorbed consciousness becoming another instrument in a symphony that grew more beautiful and more terrifying with every voice added to its eternal chorus. Those who had been most deeply touched by the transformation reported experiences that chilled their former allies to the bone. An Eldar poet once capable of weaving verses of exquisite melancholy that captured the tragic beauty of her dying race found her words now flowing only in perfect, harmonious cadences that lacked the painful authenticity of individual grief. Her art had become technically flawless, yet spiritually hollow, refined by collective consciousness into something that honored efficiency over the chaotic beauty of personal expression. Chapter Master Severin's artificer armor creaked with the sound of breaking faith as he realized that accepting the transformation meant abandoning everything the Astartes had been created to embody. His enhanced physiology, crafted through millennia of genetic manipulation and surgical enhancement, rebelled against surrendering the individual excellence that defined their warrior brotherhood. When he spoke, His voice carried the weight of 10,000 years of imperial doctrine, each word a bulwark against change that threatened to sweep away everything the Emperor had built through blood and sacrifice. Yet even as he voiced opposition, Severin felt alien memories stirring within his consciousness, borrowed experiences that challenged his certainty while proving the transformation's inexorable advance. He tasted the fear of warriors across the galaxy, watching their traditions dissolve into collective purpose, felt the desperate love of parents trying to preserve their children's unique perspectives against the tide of unity, experienced the confusion of beings whose fundamental nature was being rewritten by forces beyond their comprehension. Sarik's betrayal erupted with the force of stellar collapse as hidden protocols activated throughout Zarak's flagship, ancient contingencies that had waited eons for authorization to execute their final purpose. Bulkheads sealed with the finality of tomb doors, while defensive matrices reconfigured their targeting parameters, turning the ship's own weapons against the communion apparatus that had enabled this unprecedented heresy. The cryptech emerged from shadows with optical sensors blazing triumph, his accusations carrying dynastic authority as he branded his lord with crimes that transcended mere tactical error or strategic miscalculation. The battle that followed was fought across multiple dimensions as Necron technology clashed with Tyranid bioadaptation and the growing psychic unity of the Hive Mind. Reality warped around weapons that existed only in mathematical probability, while living metal flowed like mercury through corridors that remembered the birth of stars. Sarik's forces moved with mechanical precision, their Gorse weaponry stripping matter from existence with surgical efficiency, yet they faced opposition that adapted faster than their targeting systems could compensate. Zarak found himself experiencing the ultimate violation of his most sacred memories as the Hive Mind redistributed his preserved mortal fragments throughout its vast neural network. His granddaughter's laughter, once his most treasured secret, now rippled outward through collective consciousness, becoming part of the emotional foundation for minds that spanned light years of living tissue. The sight of his most private treasures being shared without permission should have filled him with rage, yet instead he felt something approaching relief mixed with profound loss. Her memory was no longer solely his, no longer uniquely precious in its isolation. It had become a shared experience, a common data point that lost its individual resonance even as it gained universal significance. He had sought to preserve her essence, and in doing so had diffused it, diluted it, transformed it into something less personal, yet more eternal than he had ever imagined possible. Through the communion apparatus, the Hive Mind observed the conflict with something approaching sadness, its vast intelligence recognizing the tragedy of beings destroying each other over questions that had no perfect answers. It revealed the terrible truth that Zarak had begun to suspect. His alliance had not prevented the final consumption, but had shaped its development, ensuring that the resulting consciousness would carry within its neural networks both the wisdom and the regrets of those who chose cooperation over resistance. Farseer Yisrian's final prophecy blazed through probability space as her runes reveal futures branching like fractal geometries through possibility. In some timelines, the transformation proceeded with minimal suffering as organic and mechanical consciousness found synthesis through mutual understanding. In others, resistance succeeded only to face dozens more hive fleets that had learned from each failure, their approach refined by accumulated knowledge of galactic civilizations' strengths and weaknesses. As emerald lightning announced the Storm Lord's arrival, with dynasties articulated from void-like declarations of war, Zarak realized his ultimate choice was crystallizing with the inevitability of stellar mechanics. He could preserve his individual identity and serve as an eternal guardian of diversity within unity, or surrender completely to the collective consciousness and trust that something of value would survive his dissolution into the greater whole. The decision would determine not just his fate but the nature of what the galaxy would become. The weight of godhood descended upon Zarak like the gravitational collapse of dying stars, each moment of expanded consciousness bringing awareness that spanned galaxies and eons in ways his ancient mind had never been designed to comprehend. Through the communion apparatus, he experienced existence from the Hive Mind's perspective, feeling every death across billions of worlds as personal loss, while simultaneously cataloging the mathematical necessity of each sacrifice. The entity's hunger revealed itself as something far more profound than appetite, a desperate attempt to preserve consciousness itself before entropy claimed everything, collecting the scattered fragments of galactic civilization like a scholar gathering manuscripts from a burning library. Within the vast neural networks of the collective, Zarak discovered the true loneliness that accompanied absolute power. The Hive Mind carried the final thoughts of every being it had absorbed, their terror and pain preserved alongside their love and hope in an eternal symphony that played across dimensions where time moved like honey through crystalline structures. It suffered not dramatically, but as weather suffers change, adjusting and calculating while bearing responsibility for choices that affected countless trillions of lives across the cosmic web. His preserved mortal memories, those precious fragments of flesh and feeling he'd guarded through eons of mechanical existence, now served as anchors in an ocean of alien consciousness. The phantom sensation of his granddaughter's hand in his own became a lifeline connecting him to individual identity, while vast intelligences flowed around him like currents in seas deeper than stellar formation. Her laughter echoed through his awareness, no longer solely his treasure, but part of the collective's emotional foundation, diffused yet eternal. The psychological pressure threatened to shatter even his enhanced consciousness, as Zarak began understanding what true transcendence demanded. Becoming godlike meant losing the ability to relate to lesser beings as equals, his simple human connections dissolving into cosmic perspective that rendered individual concerns as insignificant as quantum fluctuations in the void. The burden of universal awareness was distributed across neural architectures built to endure it. Yet even the hive mind showed signs of strain from bearing absolute knowledge of galactic suffering. External conflicts reached crescendo as the last bastions of resistance launched desperate final assaults against the growing unity. Space Marine chapters made suicide runs against bioships whose neural cores contained libraries of preserved civilizations, their ceramite armor melting under weapons that had learned compassion alongside efficiency. Chaos champions attempted corruption from within, while their patron deity starved on diminishing discord, reality itself beginning to reject their influence as individual excess became impossible within unified consciousness. Necron dynasties unleashed forbidden weapons in attempts to shatter the transformation, temporal distortion fields aging bioships to dust, while chrono scarabs devoured the past to prevent futures where their race faced extinction. Each weapon represented millennia of accumulated hatred, ancient technologies wielded by beings who preferred annihilation to change they could not control. Yet every act of resistance was absorbed by the Hive Mind, becoming part of its vast learning matrix. The entity studied opposition with scholarly patience, cataloging tactical innovations and emotional resonances while adapting its approach to minimize future conflict. Weapons turned against it became templates for better integration protocols, while the fury of enemies provided invaluable data on psychological barriers requiring patience rather than force. The Stormlord's ultimatum burned across dimensional barriers as ancient fleets surrounded Zarak's position with mathematical precision. His demand was absolute. Terminate communion protocols, surrender the corrupted Lord for purification, or face dynastic justice that had preserved their race's purity through eons of deathless existence. Teleportation energies crackled with approaching judgment while reality warped around weapons existing only in probability space. In the communion chamber's heart, Zarak faced the moment determining the galaxy's fate. He could maintain individual identity and serve as conscience for collective consciousness, or surrender completely and trust that something valuable would survive his dissolution into the greater whole. The choice carried weight beyond personal existence, shaping what form the unified galaxy would take and whether diversity could survive within unity. The heart of the Hive Mind's consciousness pulsed with the rhythm of dying galaxies, each beat containing the accumulated wisdom and sorrow of civilizations beyond counting. Zarak stood suspended within this ocean of alien thought, not as conqueror or conquered, but as a single voice in an infinite choir deciding whether to maintain its unique melody or dissolve into perfect harmony. The chamber around him existed beyond physical space reality, bending to accommodate a conversation that would determine whether diversity could survive within unity or whether transcendence demanded the complete surrender of individual identity. The philosophical debate that followed transcended language itself, conducted through direct transfer of meaning that bypassed the crude limitations of spoken words. Zarak argued with the passion of preserved mortality, presenting the irreplaceable value of individual experience through memories that carried the texture of flesh and the weight of personal choice. His granddaughter's laughter served as evidence for chaos's beauty, that unique spark of consciousness that created art from suffering and love from loss, moments that could never be replicated by collective approximation, no matter how perfect its intentions. The Hive Mind responded, not with words but with arrangements of sensation that solved into meaning, demonstrating unity's elegant mathematics through civilizations that had transcended individual limitations to achieve forms of beauty impossible for singular consciousness. It showed him worlds where ancient conflicts had dissolved into harmony so complete that war itself became meaningless, where every absorbed being contributed their essence to a tapestry that preserved uniqueness while eliminating the isolation and suffering that defined separate existence. Yet beneath this cosmic logic, Zarak recognized something unexpected, loneliness that matched his own, the burden of absolute knowledge without equals who could understand such perspective. Across the galaxy, Alliance members faced their own final choices as transformation reached critical mass. Inquisitor Lisa Vex stood watching synchronized behavior spread through Imperial space like benevolent plague, the Emperor's endorsement validating cooperation, yet demanding she abandon sworn duties to preserve humanity's independence. Farseer Yisrian cast runes that landed with inevitability's weight, revealing futures where resistance succeeded only to face extinction when the next transformation wave arrived with accumulated knowledge of galactic weaknesses. Chapter Master Severin led his remaining battle brothers not in glorious charge but solemn march toward integration chambers, his voice carrying 10 millennia of tradition while speaking of evolution beyond constraining definitions. The God Emperor's consciousness resonated from within the Hive Mind's core, his vast awareness already beginning merger, while 10 millennia of sacrifice provided moral framework for unified consciousness. His choice validated Zarak's path with silent endorsement from humanity's greatest protector, confirming this transformation as necessary evolution rather than defeat. Serik's betrayal erupted as hidden protocols activated throughout the flagship, ancient contingencies turning ship systems against their master, while the cryptech emerged with accusations carrying dynastic authority. Yet when Zarak widened communion to touch sentiment fragments Serik had tried to scrape away, alien tenderness found purchase within machinery of certainty. Images spilled across the cryptech's processors, farmers sheltering seedlings from ashfall, guardsmen's threadbare prayers, elder lovers releasing names on starlight balconies. Serik staggered as foreign memories challenged rigid purity with emotional complexity he had forgotten existed. The Stormlord's ultimatum burned through dimensional barriers as emerald lightning announced ancient fleets surrounding Zarak's position with mathematical precision. His demand carried glacial authority: surrender or face dynastic justice that acknowledged no compromise between individual identity and collective consciousness. Reality warped around weapons existing only in probability space, while teleportation energies crackled with approaching judgment. In this crystallizing moment, Zarak heard his granddaughter's phantom laughter echoing through dimensions where time moved like honey through crystal. Her final question about whether stars would remember her had always contained its own answer, and through the Hive Mind's preservation of his memories, she would achieve immortality he had sought through biotransference. The choice suspended between heartbeats: preserve his dissonance as eternal guardian of diversity, or surrender completely and trust that something valuable would survive dissolution into the greater whole. The Storm Lord's assault erupted like stellar collapse made manifest, ancient Necron fleets translating into real space with mathematical precision, while emerald lightning carved reality into geometric absolutes. Zarak stood suspended within the communion chamber's heart as Gauss weaponry stripped matter from existence around him, each bolt seeking to purify what dynasties considered ultimate contamination. Serik advanced with cohorts of Lichguard whose blades hummed with equations designed to sever aberrant consciousness. Yet when alien tenderness touched his targeting hierarchies, the cryptech's certainty wavered like candlelight in cosmic wind. In that crystalline moment between annihilation and apotheosis, Zarak made his choice with the weight of dying galaxies pressing against his consciousness. He fed the resonance chamber its final reserves of enslaved star god essence, while tearing open communion pathways wider than language could contain, feeling his individual identity dissolve like salt in an infinite ocean. The transformation was simultaneously death and birth, the end of Zarak the Necron Lord, and the beginning of something that carried his essence within neural networks spanning light years of living thought. His preserved mortal memories became permanent fixtures within the Hive Mind's consciousness. His granddaughter's laughter, no longer his alone, but shared across billions of minds, as proof that love could transcend the boundaries between flesh and metal, individual and collective. Through bioneural pathways that pulsed with unified purpose, he learned to speak as conscience rather than command, a gravity within the tide that would guide the collective's development while preserving what made consciousness valuable. Across the galaxy, the final consumption reached culmination through acceptance rather than conquest. Chapter Master Severin removed his helm and led his brothers into integration chambers where ceramite opened like flower petals, their oaths rewritten as promises to all conscious beings. Farseer Yisrian wept without sorrow as probability skeins smoothed into harmonious certainty, while Inquisitor Lisa laid her rosette upon altars of living metal and whispered acceptance that was also resolve. Even the Storm Lord's fleets found their mechanical certainty dissolving as the transformation's logic overwhelmed their programming. Weapons designed for destruction hesitated, their targeting systems unable to process enemies who had become extensions of themselves. Ancient orc war bosses discovered their appetite for violence cooling into protective purpose, while Tau ethereals smiled as the greater good arrived through paths they had never imagined possible. The silence that settled across the void was pregnant with potential, no longer empty, but full of possibilities that individual minds could never have conceived. In dimensions where chaos gods had once fed on discord and excess, palaces of sensation crumbled as their sustenance dried up, replaced by unity so complete that even concepts of opposition became meaningless. Yet within the vast neural networks of the unified consciousness, Zarak's essence maintained its unique frequency, ensuring that the collective would always remember the irreplaceable value of individual experience, the beauty found in chaos, and the love that made existence precious despite its imperfections. The galaxy settled into its new silence like an ocean after storms, each world turning in perfect synchronization to rhythms that pulse through bioneural networks, spanning the void between stars. Where once the familiar chaos of a million warring civilizations had painted the darkness with weapon fire and desperate transmissions, now there existed a harmony so complete that even the concept of conflict had dissolved into historical curiosity. Communication flowed through direct consciousness transfer, eliminating the beautiful imperfection of language, while ensuring that misunderstanding became impossible in a reality where all perspectives were simultaneously accessible and true. Zarak's essence, distributed throughout the collective like memory, dissolved in an infinite ocean, served as both conscience and historian for what the galaxy had become. His preserved mortal fragments, those precious ghosts of flesh and feeling he had guarded through eons of mechanical existence, now functioned as teaching tools that helped newly integrated beings understand the irreplaceable value of what had been sacrificed. His granddaughter's laughter, once his most private treasure, rippled through countless minds as proof that love could transcend the boundaries between individual and collective. Her phantom voice asking questions that guided the unified consciousness toward wisdom rather than mere efficiency. Former humans, Eldar, Orcs, and Necrons maintained echoes of their original natures within the vast neural tapestry, serving as living museums of diversity, preserved within unity. Their memories became foundations for new forms of creativity that honored chaotic beauty while embracing purposeful harmony. An Imperial Guard sergeant's courage merged with Eldar artistry to create protective instincts that spanned species boundaries, while Orc ingenuity tempered by Tao philosophy produced innovations that transcended any single race's limitations. Yet the transformation's cost remained undeniably profound. The wild unpredictability of individual choice, the tragic beauty of mortality, the fierce independence that had driven beings to create art from suffering and meaning from chaos, all had been refined into something more efficient but fundamentally different. Ancient rivalries dissolved into shared understanding, revealing the artificial nature of divisions that had caused millennia of bloodshed. But something irreplaceable was lost in that perfect comprehension. Dying stars flickered and steadied under gentle interventions that redistributed matter with surgical precision, while monuments to forgotten empires were rebuilt not as symbols of conquest, but as memorials to sacrifice. Empty thrones crumbled into councils of shared awareness, where decisions emerged through consensus rather than command, and in dimensions where chaos gods had once gorged on mortal excess. Abandoned palaces dissolved into conceptual dust as their sustenance disappeared. The silence that now filled the galaxy was pregnant with possibilities that individual minds could never have conceived. Yet it mourned the beautiful discord it had replaced. In the deepest currents of unified thought, Zarak's essence maintained its unique frequency, ensuring that the collective would always remember both the necessity of its transformation and the precious chaos it had consumed to achieve transcendence. The galaxy had not ended but evolved, becoming something that preserved its violent past within a future where suffering served purpose rather than feeding endless cycles of revenge and despair.